I just want to tell the audience that Laura, who's behind the little logo, will be recording the session because most of our followers are in the US where it's the middle of the night, and in Europe and Africa where it's quite early.
Yes.
So we want to make sure people can rewatch it after, and we'll be live streaming it on social media as well. So taking questions from social media and asking them here as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No, of course. So before we jump straight into the questions, because I know that you have half an hour and we received a lot of questions ahead of the discussion, I just wanted to quickly introduce the topic and the structure of the event. So as I said, it will last 30 minutes. I have hundreds of questions for you as well, but I'll try to keep it to 45.
Yes, I'm not sure we'll get to 100.
Yeah, it might be a bit tough, but 4 or 5 so that we can take questions from the audience and address them as we go afterwards. And what we'll be discussing is, number one, how the COVID-19 crisis is impacting people across the world and in Australia, but specifically women. We have seen across the world that women are specifically impacted in different ways. So I'm French. In France, domestic violence went up by 36% in the first week of the crisis. So a very systematic impact on women. And second, and this is why we are so thrilled to have you here, how to have more women in politics and why we need more women in politics in general across the world.
Great.
So the 2 main topics we'll be discussing, and I think that you don't need a big introduction because most people here already know you, but to say 2 words about you, if you allow me. You have been elected to the Australian Senate as the youngest, I think, popularly elected person in Australia.
Yes.
The youngest woman as well, which is amazing. And you've been a very strong women's rights advocate throughout your career. And this is why we reached out. We have a campaign running on women's rights, and we really wanted to hear from you. And we actually had quite a few requests to invite you for those digital town halls. So thank you.
That's nice to know.
Yeah, we have a lot of members in Australia that kept on telling us, oh, invite her, she'll have so much to add to the discussion. So we're like,
oh, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So to jump straight into it, I wanted to know if you could tell us a bit how the COVID-19 situation is in Australia to start.
Look, it's been, a strange time, as it has been for everybody. We're really lucky here. We had our government act quite quickly in comparison, and to perhaps some of the other countries, particularly the US, I'm thinking. And we are now really starting to talk about how we, get out of this crisis, what we do to restart the economy, what type of world we want post-COVID-19. A lot of the restrictions are already starting to be lifted. But of course, for a country like Australia, that is something that was perhaps easier to do because we are an island. And so we closed our borders very quickly and put quarantine measures in place very quickly. And that is what really helped to maintain the spread of the virus. Our government, federal, state, they all kind of work together in a way that perhaps is a bit unprecedented. Governments who were, from different parties and different sides of the political spectrum have actually been working quite well together in comparison to perhaps previous debates and issues that we've dealt with. But I also think the overriding response for Australia has been that our governments have taken the science and the health expertise and responded to that first and foremost. And it makes me really wonder, imagine what we could do if we were applying the same type of attitude to the climate change, looking after the environment, issues of inequality, issues of inequality in relation to women, but also, of course, in relation to poverty. Imagine if we took an evidence-based approach, how well we could respond. I think that's been the most fundamental aspect that I've noticed and been very glad to see work. Of course, this means, however, though, that because of the restrictions that were put in place, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of businesses have gone bust, and that has a longer term impact on our economy. And as time goes on, on the society, young people in particular have been hit the hardest. They far outweigh the older generations when it comes to the unemployment rate, underemployment. They were in more insecure work in the first place. So in the hospitality industry, in retail, in arts, entertainment, all of those, tourism, all of those kind of areas that were really hit the hardest. That's where there's more insecure work, and younger people tend to be employed. Of course, then there is the overarching issue of women in those jobs as well, and that the number of women being impacted by the economic response of COVID-19 is going to be something that we're going to have to manage for a long time.
I mean, one, it's great to hear that the government is managing to work together across party lines and so on to respond to the crisis. It's not something we have seen everywhere. So, good that it's happening in Australia.
Look, I think it's important to say, they're not agreeing on everything. Of course, politics is politics. But it has been unprecedented, the level of cooperation, and that all of us from most sides of politics have been on the same page, particularly when we had to tell people and explain to the community to stay home, don't go out, don't go to work unless you really have to, work from home where you can, limit your movements, do that social distancing. The fact that the community was hearing that from all different sides of the political spectrum, I think really meant that they listened and they cooperated very, very well with that health advice.
I mean, that's amazing. And what you were saying about, if we applied evidence-based policies and listened to scientific advice for other crises like climate change, resonates a lot. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted Vanessa Nakate, a climate activist from Uganda, who was saying that what COVID has shown, it's that we are capable of dealing with emergencies and dealing with emergencies as emergencies. So it would be amazing if we managed to actually convince general governments to do the same for all overarching crises.
I think that's right. And I think the evidence-based approach, listening to the science and being able to move quickly to limit what could be further and worsening conditions further down the track. So, a lot of the resistance from our governments in Australia, particularly the Conservative governments, to acting on climate change has been, well, the economic impact is too hard. The economic impact's going to be, too broad. It's too difficult to do. We don't even want to have the fight with industry and business. But of course, what this has shown is that if you need to act and you do it quickly, you do it concisely, and you do it with clear communication, you can help to limit the pain further on, which of course we all know that if we don't deal with climate change in a much faster pace than we currently are, not just here in Australia, but around the rest of the world, the pain is going to be felt much harder and much longer. And it's going to be the next generation that are really going to suffer.
No, completely. I'm at the same time starting to pull questions from social media, and we got one linked to COVID and our main topic, which is, do you think that this is just a health crisis, or do you think that gender has a specific aspect to it? Do you think that it impacts women differently than it impacts men?
I do think, of course, this is a health crisis, and the virus doesn't discriminate, but the conditions by which people are able to respond to the virus are discriminatory. If you are from low socioeconomic background, if you have a lower health kind of outcomes anyway, if you're in Australia, if you're an Indigenous person, one of the First Nations people, you're more susceptible to a lot of the health implications of COVID-19. But of course, the economic impact is disproportionately being felt by women because of two key reasons. One, the insecure nature of women's work. being more casualized, being in sectors that are more face-to-face interaction. So you can't do that job from home. If you're a hairdresser, you have to go to work. You can't, social distancing is very difficult. So you either lose your income or you put yourself at risk and your family at risk. And of course, then there's the impact on those essential workers that we've been relying on, the nurses, the teachers, the people who are looking after the essential workers' children, childcare workers, so that essential workers can go to work while everybody else is able to stay safely at home. Overwhelmingly, these workers are women. So not only are women feeling the economic impact because the industries they come from are disproportionately affected, but the women who are working in response are really put at a higher risk as well. So yes, I do think this is a women's crisis, and that's before we even touch on the impact of women who are vulnerable in their own homes. You mentioned before the element of domestic violence growing in France. We are hearing those statistics right around the world that when people are told to stay at home and services are shut down, it puts more women in a perilous situation, and of course their children.
Which is dramatic. And so the next question would probably take an hour to answer properly, but if you can give us a few tips. We have, as you mentioned, social distancing is a luxury in many places around the world, and women feel the crisis disproportionately. What can we do to make sure that no woman is left behind? Like, as a senator, what do you think should be done? What should the governments across the world do?
Look, I think the responses to governments in each country obviously have to be tailored to that community. But having every government should have their eyes wide open to the gender imbalance that this creates, the group of women that it impacts on as either responders, as essential workers, or the people who are caught economically in the middle of it. And of course, for those who are managing households and families, who is it that does the caring? It's women. So they can't it's very easy to say, oh, if there's somebody who might be sick in your home, isolate yourself. Women don't isolate ourselves from our children or our partners. We step into that caring role and we look after them. So at each level, I think women are combated by this. And so, of course, I think the main thing for governments right around the world is to acknowledge that. And so then to look for strategies that fit their community with that lens in place. Here in Australia, of course, one of the things that we have been disappointed in relation to our government's response, the health response has been good, the economic response has been needing a bit more work. And one of the things that the government here has failed to do is look after workers who are casually employed. So there was a type of wage subsidy that was put on the table for people and businesses that were impacted, a weekly amount for those who could prove that they had lost their income as a result of this. It didn't apply to people who were casual workers. So that is an extraordinary number of women in this country. So the government has to do better on that front. And I think as we come out of COVID-19, one of the things I keep hearing so much from constituents and members of the community here in Australia, but also around the rest of the world, people who message me on Instagram or on Facebook and say, we don't want to go back to the way the world used to be. We want, our world has been suffering for quite some time. Groups in our community have been feeling under pressure for a long, long time. We've got entire nations that have been struggling without much leadership for a long time. We don't want to just go back to the way things were. We actually want to build a world that is cleaner, that is safer, and that is fairer. And I really think that's the role that governments need to take now. As we come out of this, what things do we want to put in place to make sure that that core issue that ripples through every democracy, nations without democratic systems, that issue of inequality felt by women and girls, I think this is an opportunity as we reset and rebuild to correct those scales.
Completely, especially because I think Zika and Ebola showed that, once lockdowns and restrictions were lifted in countries impacted, women were the one most affected in going back to the workforce. So while men,
Yes.
it took like a couple of months, I think, to get back to their original salaries because obviously the economies were doing less well and so on. For women, it took years, and a lot of them could not go back to the workforce directly or could only go back part-time and so on. So you mentioned that in Australia, the lockdown and restrictions are being lifted. Do you see any ways of addressing the issue of women having access to the workplace post COVID-19?
Yes, I think there's a real need to have this conversation. And the Prime Minister here in Australia yesterday actually announced a kind of a task force or a commitment to work with business groups and unions to come up with a kind of a new industrial relations pact agreement to how we get the country out of this COVID coma and to reinvest in the economy. One of the key things he needs to do in this is to make sure that those issues of inequality in the workforce, the wage gap, the insecure work that women overwhelmingly are faced with, particularly in the service industries and those caring industries, that is addressed as we go through this. One of the things that really strikes me about COVID-19 is people say, well, the virus, as I was mentioning before, the virus doesn't discriminate. But if you are in a job where you only get paid for the hours that you work, if you don't have any sick leave, if you don't have any savings because you've been on a low income, if you've got kids at home that need food and shelter, if you've got a partner who's been laid off, you don't have the luxury of not going to work. So you are constantly having to weigh those things up. Less money to put food on the table for your family, or go to work and put yourself and then your family at risk when you come home each day. And so I think women right around the world have been confronted with this. And as we come out of it, making sure that as we structure the economy one of the key things we need to do is strive for universal access for sick leave. If you are sick and you're not able to go to work, you shouldn't be punished for that. I think we need to be looking at how we ensure that people who are sick still are able to access income.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, for me, universal healthcare and universal access to sick leave in France has been the case since I was born. So it's something that seems very natural, but then we hear from our members from around the world how they struggle with this in various countries. And it always, it's completely abnormal, especially in this crisis, that because you're trying to keep your family safe.
Well, and this crisis has really highlighted that difference, and the difference between the societies that have universal healthcare. And Australia is very lucky that we have universal healthcare, but we don't have universal access to sick leave. So, that's been the gap for us. And what this crisis has really shown is that unless the groups in the community and the nations that have these types of systems in place are able to respond faster and quicker and to kind of deal with have been able to deal with the pandemic much faster in a much more humane way. Yeah.
We've been receiving quite a few questions on social media, so not to monopolize the conversation, get to this as well. One of them is, across the world, we've seen that countries with strong female leadership or countries that almost have achieved parity have been doing much better. We've seen a correlation, from New Zealand to Germany and so on. And so the question of parity, I think, has been put at the center of the table again. Someone on social media asked how you think we can push more women to be active in politics in general. And what are the biggest barriers? I'll just link it to the next one. What are the biggest barriers for women in Australia entering politics?
Well, I think this is a really good moment to be talking about why we need more women in parliament, why we need more women in leadership, why we need more women engaged in the political decisions that their governments are making. And it's because, women are impacted by this. And, this won't be the last crisis. This won't be the last global pandemic we have to deal with. And I think as we've become more and more of a connected and globalized world, it shines a spotlight on those issues of parity. And if there was ever a moment for women to go, you know what, we need to be at the table, because if women are at the table, they will raise these issues. There will be people there able to speak up and say, well, hang on a minute. Why is it that everybody who, these industries that are caring industries, whether they're nurses, teachers, childcare, whether they're in aged care, or indeed in those face-to-face service industries like hospitality and retail, why is there such a wage gap of the women who work in those industries versus men who work in others? I think this is a real opportunity for women to stand up and say, oh, we can see what happens. We're more vulnerable in the good times, and we're certainly more vulnerable in the bad times. So what better way to try and turn that around than to get at the table to be part of that decision making? I also think that women, I've been in politics now for 13 years, and I think one of the key elements that I've observed is that women, regardless of what side of politics you come from, what political party or your background, and this is a generalization, but I found it to be very true, that women are prepared to listen to the expertise and the experts, consider the expert advice, and then talk to each other about how this would be implemented. What I've seen from some of my male counterparts is, no, we don't care what the briefing says. We've made our mind up and we're going with this. Until how do I say? Until shit hits the fan. I don't know if you know that saying, but in Australia, that's when everything goes belly up. And so I think women really do bring an element to decision making that helps to listen to expertise and then work at how it's practically implemented. And it's just, it is something that when we're at the table, we can inject. Look, and I think if you really want to see the countries that are doing really well out of this, look who's leading them. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the Prime Minister in Finland, like just amazing women. Angela Merkel is doing her best in Germany right now. From all sides of politics, women who are at the front are coming to this with both the understanding of empathy, but also the ability to take on board expertise and then think about how that would be translated in the real world.
No, I mean, and you said it's a generalization, but I think studies have actually proven exactly what you say. Women are more inclined to listen to expert advice, but also cross more party lines. And when you have parity in a country, you have better democratic governance, less corruption, and better results for society as a whole.
And I do think that cooperation, you mentioned crossing party lines. I do think, from what I've observed, women tend to have less of a problem with going outside our usual team and reaching across the chamber, across the party line to say, okay, you might have a good idea here. How can we work on this together?
And to this end, I saw in an article, I think that you are trying to work to have a woman caucus in the Senate. Do you want to tell us a bit about this? And how?
I know in other countries around the world there's some really successful women's caucuses. Australia is a very bipartisan culture in politics, and I come from the Greens, and so I'm kind of one of the third parties. But the culture in Australia has been very much team one and team two, and never should they cross. I think that's starting to change, and I know the European examples, many of the kind of emerging parties throughout Asia. Of course, we can see some examples in Southern America. I think this is starting to change. People can show that you can come from different places and all agree that equality for women and working across party lines is good for everybody. And I think climate change is going to be a real driver of that. I've watched the activist response to climate change very closely over the years, and what is amazing me right now is that it is women and young women who are really leading those campaigns on the climate change front. And I think that is forcing our political leaders to think about how they work closer together as women as well. So look, I'm hopeful. It's going to take a cultural change in Australia to do that, but it's baby steps, and it does take cultural change. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it doesn't take long. You don't have to be in politics for long to realize that women, it's still pretty much that politics is still very much a boys' game and a man's world, and that regardless of what side, us women need to stick together.
I couldn't agree more with this. It's also why we have a campaign, pushing for parity in politics across the world. Is we think women make up for 50% of the world population. They should have a say on at least 50%.
Oh, well, absolutely. And one of the biggest barriers, of course, to women getting into politics is that the culture is very blocky, that women have kind of been seen to be, it's kind of a luxury to have some women in there. They're not really needed. And that is slowly being broken down. There are many amazing women in politics here in Australia long before I came along. I happen to be the youngest, but there were plenty of others who paved the way before me. And I think getting us to a point of parity, I think, is really important. It instantly changes the atmosphere in the political debate, and I think for the better.
I know we said half an hour, but could I maybe ask you 2 more questions? We got to try to answer everything. Perfect. Thank you. So we received quite a few. So I'm sorry to the audience, if I disregard any. I'm trying to summarize them. So we've had a few questions about how, there's a lot of barriers to women entering politics. And someone asked whether political parties in candidates' elections could hinder the impact of having more women in parliaments. And I want to link this to another question we got, which is, how can we ensure parity? Do you believe that having, either zipper systems, quota systems, or hard measures in place to make sure that we get to 50% is a good idea?
Yes. Look, I think we've seen that without putting in place some type of structure to get more women into politics, it doesn't just happen on its own. And it's the same in the business world. You want to get more women around the board table. If you want more women CEOs and in senior management, you actually have to put quotas in place to drive that. Just leaving it up to chance doesn't work. Of course, there's always that argument of merit. You should be there on merit. Well, I can tell you, I've sat around the Senate chamber in Australia for quite a few years, and if merit is how some of those blokes got there, heaven help us. It is just not true. There are plenty of women who could do that job just as well, and many of them better. So I do think we have to put in place some structures, and I think that includes that you've got to start that with the parties. I think political parties need to be proactive about how they select candidates and how they prepare candidates. You know, one of the things that we've seen in Australia is that often parties put women into the more harder seats to win, the marginal seats, which makes it more risk. It's riskier. You know, they'll win it or they won't. The safer seats go to men. You know, this is not always the case, but this has been the culture, and that we're having to try and turn around. So I think yes, political parties have to take some responsibility, but so does the parliament as a whole, and our response to it. I've had to call out some pretty bad behaviour in the Senate, directed at me, but also, you know, subjected to from other women. We have to change the way our parliaments work. Many of them, particularly those of us who have based on the Westminster system, some of it's still pretty archaic. It was designed by men at the time. Things have changed. They're not very family friendly. You want more women, particularly young women, in politics. You've got to change the way Parliament works in order to allow for women to have their caring responsibilities as mothers, as well as being politicians. And you know what? That's good for blokes too. That's good for men as well. You know, men these days don't want to have to spend weeks and weeks away from their families. They want to be involved in their kids' life. So it's actually good for everybody to be able to make these changes. But overwhelmingly, it will help women.
And I think, I actually, just before you joined the event, I was asked by someone in the audience why we chose to invite you, and why we were so excited for this event. And those are two of the things that really came up ahead of the event, was what you did with your daughter, bringing her to the Senate and sparking the debate around care duties, and making sure that working parents and working mothers as well get to bring their children and care for them. And the second was the defamation suit that I think online against
yes
attacks.
Yes, against a former colleague. He's now no longer in the parliament, but he was at the time. And that's been quite a landmark case here in Australia, because very rarely are women able to take up defamation cases against things that have been said about them, and particularly when it's sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. So often what happens is that if a woman even dares to put their head up and say, you know what, I'm being treated badly in my workplace, it's the bloke who comes in and then sues for defamation. So what I did was turn that around and turn it on its head. That's been a very, very tough but also enlightening process for me. I wouldn't wish it on anybody to have to go through that legal process to get justice and to vindicate after being harassed in your workplace or in your home or at some kind of social club. It was just devastating. It was difficult to do, but really important, because I think the Parliament needs to represent what kind of society we want. And you can't have a Parliament where women are treated in such an appalling way, and that it simply is written off as, oh, well, that's politics, and if you can't handle it, you shouldn't be here. The types of things that I had to take on were sexist bullying and kind of really underhanded tactics that were designed to intimidate me and to shut me down and to throw me off my game, to silence me. And, you know, I've been elected to that chamber 4 times now, and I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not gonna put up with being bullied anymore.
And honestly, thank you for this, because so this article actually came up last year. In Europe, there were the European elections, and along with Andrea, who's also in this chat, we co-founded a pan-European party, and we run, you know, gender equal and fully, you know, 50% of women lists across European countries. And one of the biggest issues we encountered in trying to convince people to run, and I run myself, was, you know, a lot of young women, especially, saying, well, you know, all of the attacks I'm going to get, all of the sexism, all of the discrimination I'm going to have in my face, I don't want to go through this. And to be fair, this was also the case. I didn't want to go through this. And we saw, I think, an op-ed you wrote in The Guardian, but then we also read about the stories and shared it within the group of young women running for elections across Europe. And it was super inspiring to see this for women really across the continent. And I think it motivated a lot of people to say, okay, I'm not going to take this. I know it's going to be tough, but, you know, I'm going to put it out, and I'm still going to go for politics. So thank you. I can't imagine what it must have been like, but it was very inspiring, at least for us on this side of the world.
Well, thank you. And look, I'm glad that it helped in that situation, and I am glad it helped to encourage women to still stand and to put their hand up for election, because one of the things I had feared for a long time was that if I raised my grievances, if I talked about this type of treatment, that would put women off politics, and that's the last thing I would want to do. But I came to the realization that this is happening all over the place. And this is happening in politics, and it happens in people's workplaces, and it happens in schools, and it happens in social circles. But if it's happening in politics in broad daylight, in front of the media glare, in front of you know, parliamentary colleagues, and it goes unchallenged, then the signal that sends to people is that this is okay. And it will put even more women off getting involved. So I spoke up, really, because I needed to defend myself. And I wanted to really send a message to my daughter, actually, and her peers, that this type of behavior is not okay. And every woman and every girl has a right to feel safe and be respected in her workplace. And you only change that culture if you call it out, and if you and you can only expect more women to participate if they know that it's okay to say that this is not all right. Because politics is still deeply blocky. It is still very much, women are the trolling that you get, the sexist comments, that kind of nastiness has a very gendered lens to it. We've got to change that, but we're only going to change that if more people get involved.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a perfect way to end it as well, on a call for more women to get active in politics and to change the culture across the world to make sure we reach parity within our lifetime and equality.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely, and yeah, I hope. And look, if there's anyone out there who's listening and wants to, you know, have more conversation, or follow me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, you know, please do. And yeah, I want to see more women elected, and whatever I can do to help that, I will.
Perfect. And we'll be sharing the recording of this video on social media with all of your social media accounts, so people can follow you and ask you further questions. I also just wanted to share the results of the poll that was launched. Over 75% of participants are more hopeful about women's rights post-COVID. So I think you've inspired a lot of people throughout the talk. So thank you for this.
Wow, that's really good news. That's fantastic news. I'm inherently an optimistic person, so I always look for those silver linings. And if one thing out of COVID is that more women want to get involved in shaping the world going forward, fantastic.
Amazing. And then we'll push more people to do that. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.